He stood in front of the cameras with dry eyes. His voice was steady, his hands were still, and when the reporter asked him what he wanted to say to his missing wife, he looked directly into the lens and said he just wanted his family back home. The problem was, by the time those words left his mouth, they were already gone. August 13th, 2018, Frederick, Colorado. A quiet town of 20,000 people tucked between the Rocky Mountain foothills and the flat expanse of the Eastern Plains. A town where people knew their neighbors, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where a family could disappear, and nobody saw a single thing. That morning, a woman named Nicole Atkinson pulled up to a house on Saratoga Trail and immediately felt something was wrong. She had driven Shanann Watts home from the airport just hours earlier, dropping her off in the early hours of the morning after a work trip to Phoenix. Shanann had texted her during the flight. She'd seemed fine, normal. But now, standing at the front door, Nicole was getting no answer. No texts back. No calls picked up. Shanann's car was in the driveway. Her shoes were near the door. Her purse was still inside. Shanann Watts, a 34-year-old mother of two, had simply vanished, and the man who answered the door when police finally arrived didn't panic. He wasn't frantic. He stood there, calm and composed, with an expression that would haunt investigators for days. His name was Chris Watts. He was Shanann's husband, and within 72 hours, the world would learn exactly what he had done. But to understand what happened on Saratoga Trail, you have to understand who Shanann Watts really was. Because she wasn't just a name in a missing persons report. She was a person, vivid and full, and deeply loved by the people lucky enough to know her. Shanann Marie Rzucek was born on January 10, 1984, in Spring Lake, North Carolina. She grew up in a close-knit family, the kind where Sunday dinners ran long and nobody left without a hug. Those who knew her as a child described a girl with an enormous laugh and an even bigger heart. She was the person who remembered every birthday, who called just to check in, who made everyone around her feel like the most important person in the room. She met Chris Watts in 2010, and by all outward appearances, it was a love story. They married in 2012. They built a life together. They bought a beautiful home in Frederick, Colorado, a 4-bedroom house with a manicured lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway. The kind of house that looks exactly like what a happy family is supposed to look like. By 2018, Shanann and Chris had 2 daughters who were the absolute center of Shanann's universe. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's easy smile. She loved unicorns and playing dress-up, and she had already started developing the kind of personality that made adults stop and take notice. Confident, curious, sweet. The kind of little girl who made you believe the world was going to be okay. Celeste Catherine Watts was 3. She was smaller than her sister, softer spoken, but no less full of life. Shanann called her Cece. She had a giggle that could light up a room. 2 girls shared a bedroom, and a bond that only sisters who are less than 2 years apart can truly understand. Shanann documented all of it on social media. Her Facebook and Instagram pages were a window into the Watts family life. Birthday parties and holiday mornings, beach trips and backyard barbecues. She ran a successful business through Thrive, a health and wellness company, and she used her platforms to promote the products, while also sharing the everyday moments of motherhood with disarming honesty. She talked about the hard days as much as the good ones. She was real, she was relatable, and hundreds of thousands of people followed along because they genuinely liked her. She was also pregnant, 14 weeks along with a boy she and Chris had already named Nico. By August 2018, the Watts family looked, from every possible angle, like an ordinary American family living an ordinary American life. But underneath that surface, invisible to nearly everyone around them, something had quietly begun to fracture. Chris Watts had grown up in Gastonia, North Carolina, not far from where Shanann was raised. He was quiet as a kid, reserved, a little awkward, the kind of person who didn't take up much space in a room. He worked hard, kept to himself, and seemed, by most accounts, completely unremarkable. Not in a bad way, just ordinary. By the time he and Shanann relocated to Colorado for his job with Anadarko Petroleum, Chris had settled into the rhythms of family life with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. He worked long hours. He came home. He helped with the girls on weekends. His colleagues at Anadarko described him as professional and dependable. He didn't cause problems. He didn't create drama. He was, by most measures, exactly the kind of man you'd want your daughter to marry. But people are not always what they appear to be. And in the spring and summer of 2018, Chris Watts had begun living a double life, one that his wife knew nothing about. The summer before Shanann disappeared had been a difficult one for the family. There were financial pressures that had been quietly building for months. The Watts family had stretched themselves thin, the mortgage on the house in Frederick, the costs of raising 2 small children, a third on the way. Shanann's Thrive business had brought in income, but it hadn't been enough to fully offset the stress accumulating beneath the surface. By August 2018, they were behind on the mortgage. Credit card balances had grown. The financial picture, behind closed doors, looked nothing like the one Shanann shared on social media. And there was something else. Sometime in June 2018, while Shanann was away with the girls visiting her parents in North Carolina, a trip that lasted nearly 6 weeks, Chris Watts had begun an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. The relationship moved quickly. It was intense, consuming, and entirely secret. And by the time Shanann returned to Colorado in early August, Chris had begun imagining a different life, one without his wife, without his children, without the weight of everything he had quietly grown to resent. Shanann returned from that North Carolina trip on August 9th. She and Chris had a conversation, tense, overdue, about the state of their marriage. Shanann suspected something was wrong. She had told friends before the trip that Chris seemed distant, detached, like something was pulling him somewhere she couldn't see. She didn't know about Nicole Kessinger, not yet. On the night of August 12th, Shanann boarded a plane back to Colorado after a work trip to Arizona. She landed just after midnight on August 13th. Nicole Atkinson drove her home from the airport and dropped her off at the house on Saratoga Trail somewhere around 2 in the morning. That was the last time anyone outside that house would see Shanann Watts alive. The following morning, the silence started. Nicole texted. No reply. She called, straight to voicemail. This was unusual. Shanann was almost always reachable, almost always online. She had a presentation scheduled that morning. She had sent emails as recently as midnight. And now, nothing. By late morning, Nicole was at the house. She knocked. She rang the doorbell. She called Shanann's name. Nothing. She noticed the car, the shoes. She reached out to Shanann's friends, who began flooding the phone lines with unanswered calls. Someone called the school. Bella and Celeste hadn't been dropped off. They weren't there. And when Nicole finally reached Chris, who was at work at the Anadarko field site, his response gave her pause. He didn't rush back. He didn't sound desperate. He said he'd come home. Police arrived before he did. The officers who entered the house on Saratoga Trail that afternoon found no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, nothing obviously out of place. And just a house that felt strangely empty for a home that should have had a mother and 2 small children inside it. Chris returned shortly after and was cooperative from the start. He answered questions. He gave a statement. He said he had left for work early that morning, around 5:15, and that Shanann had been home, alive, when he left. He said he didn't know where she was. He said he was worried, but even in those first hours, something was quietly, persistently wrong. His affect was flat. His body language was closed. He gave details when asked, but volunteered nothing. And when officers observed him during those early conversations, they noticed something that veteran investigators have learned to pay attention to, a stillness behind the eyes that doesn't quite match the words coming out of the mouth. Shannann's friends noticed it too. When a neighbor's doorbell camera caught Chris loading something into his truck in the pre-dawn hours, long before he claimed to have left for work, the questions that had already begun forming in the backs of investigators' minds suddenly sharpened into something much harder. Something wasn't right about Chris Watts. And by the time the sun went down on August 13th, 2018, investigators were no longer treating this as a simple missing persons case. Because if Shanann Watts and her 2 daughters had been inside that house when Chris left for work, and the evidence was beginning to suggest they never left, then there was only one question that mattered. Where did they go? Within hours of Shanann Watts being reported missing, the investigation had quietly shifted. On the surface, it was still a missing persons case. That was the official language. That was what the report said. But inside the Frederick Police Department, and among the FBI agents who had been called in to assist, the working assumption had already begun to change, because the more investigators looked at the details, the small, accumulating inconsistencies that had started piling up from the moment Chris Watts opened his front door, the more a darker picture began to take shape. This wasn't a woman who had walked away from her life. This was something else entirely. The investigation moved on multiple tracks simultaneously, the way serious cases always do. Each thread pulled carefully, each lead documented, each piece of information cross-referenced against everything else. And almost immediately, the thread started leading back to the same place, back to Chris. The first thing investigators focused on was the timeline. Chris had told officers that he left for work at approximately 5:15 in the morning on August 13th. He said Shanann had been home when he left. He said he had no idea where she had gone after that. It was a clean, simple account, the kind of story that should have been easy to verify. But it wasn't. Neighbors in the quiet subdivision on Saratoga Trail had doorbell cameras, security systems, motion-activated lights, the ordinary infrastructure of suburban life that people install without much thought and then forget about entirely. Until investigators come asking for the footage. What that footage showed was deeply specifically troubling. In the early morning hours of August 13th, well before the time Chris said he had left for work, there was movement at the Watts house. His truck was backed into the driveway at an unusual angle, not the casual pull-in of someone heading to work, the kind of deliberate positioning that leaves investigators asking why, and then he was gone. By the time Shanann's body should have been inside that house, according to his own timeline, Chris had already left. The truck had already pulled out, and security cameras along the route to the Anadarko field site picked up his vehicle, making the familiar 40-minute drive to the oil fields just outside of Rogan, Colorado. Why was he backing his truck so close to the front door at that hour? What had he been loading, and why? Now, when his pregnant wife and 2 daughters were allegedly somewhere out there, lost or in danger, why was the man on those cameras moving with such deliberate, purposeful calm? These were the questions that investigators couldn't let go of. The phone records deepened the picture. Shanann had landed at Denver International Airport just after midnight on August 13th. Records showed she had been texting as recently as the early morning hours. Communication about the following day, the kind of practical routine messages a busy working mother sends before going to sleep. She had made calls, she had sent emails, and then, at a specific point in the early morning, everything stopped. No texts, no calls, no activity of any kind. The silence was total, and it came on suddenly, like a switch being thrown. For a woman who was almost always reachable, almost always connected, a woman who had posted to social media that same night, the abrupt communications blackout was impossible to explain away as coincidence. Investigators pinpointed the window. They mapped it against what the security cameras had shown, and what emerged from that overlap was a timeline that Chris Watts had not provided, one that contradicted, in specific and damning ways, almost everything he had told police. He had known investigators were going to find this. He had to have known. And yet, he had sat across from officers with that same flat, composed expression and told them a story that the evidence was already dismantling piece by piece. On August 14th, just one day after Shanann was reported missing, investigators sat down with Chris Watts for a formal interview. It was captured on video. And watching that footage, even now, is an unsettling experience. Because Chris doesn't look like a man in crisis. He doesn't look like a husband terrified for his wife and children. He looks like someone carefully managing a situation. His words are measured, his expressions are controlled. He offers details when pressed, but pivots smoothly away from anything that cuts too close. When the interviewer leans in, Chris leans back. When the tone shifts, so does his language. He mentioned in that interview that he and Shanann had argued the morning of the 13th. He said there had been tension between them about the marriage. He said he had told her he wasn't happy. But he was vague about the specifics, and he insisted, again and again, that when he drove away from the house that morning, Shanann had been alive. Investigators listened carefully. They noted everything. And then they went back to the evidence. The FBI analysts working the digital side of the investigation had been building a portrait of Chris Watts through his devices, his accounts, and his communications. The invisible trail that people leave behind without realizing it. What they found in those records was not a grieving husband desperately searching for his family. It was a man living a completely separate life. The communications between Chris Watts and Nicole Kessinger painted a picture of a relationship that had moved well beyond a casual workplace flirtation. The messages were intimate, frequent, and pointed toward a future, one that had no room in it for Shanann, for Bella, for Celeste, or for the unborn child Shanann was carrying. In the days and weeks before August 13th, Chris and Nicole had discussed moving in together. They had talked about what life might look like without the complications tying Chris to his current one. And in the days immediately after Shanann went missing, while Chris was appearing on television, while the search was underway, while Shanann's family was flying to Colorado in desperate confusion, he and Nicole were still in contact. He wasn't searching for his family. He was managing the story. Meanwhile, investigators working the physical side of the case had focused their attention on something Chris had mentioned himself, almost casually, as if it couldn't possibly matter: his workplace. The Anadarko Petroleum facility outside Rogan. The place he said he had gone that morning. The place the cameras had confirmed he had driven to in the hours before anyone knew Shanann was missing. It was a desolate stretch of Colorado prairie, oil tanks, access roads, ground that stretched flat in every direction with almost no visibility from the surrounding landscape. It was the kind of place where something could be hidden and nobody would stumble across it accidentally. Investigators got access. What happened next shattered whatever remained of Chris Watts' carefully constructed story, because buried in the earth near the base of those oil tanks, in the ground that Chris Watts himself worked and walked across every day, investigators found what they had been desperately hoping they would not find. And Shanann Watts was discovered in a shallow grave on the property. She had been manually strangled. Her unborn son, Nico, 14 weeks along, a life that had barely begun, was buried with her. Bella and Celeste were found nearby. They had been placed inside the crude oil tanks themselves, small enough that their father had been able to lower them in, young enough that they had trusted him to the last possible moment. The officers who made those discoveries had spent careers in law enforcement. They had seen things that most people will never see, and the recovery of those two little girls, Bella, 4 years old, with her mother's dark eyes, Celeste, 3 years old, who her mother called Cece, broke something in almost everyone present. On the afternoon of August 15th, the investigators brought Chris Watts back in for questioning. They knew what they had found. Chris did not yet know exactly how much they knew, and the interrogation that followed, conducted partly by investigators and partly, in a now famous segment, by Shanann's father's friend and neighbor, Dave Pauler, who was also an agent, is one of the more psychologically complex confessions in recent true crime memory. Investigators had a card to play. There was surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera, that appeared to show an argument between Chris and Shanann inside the house in those early morning hours. Investigators told Chris they had footage of Shanann and the girls leaving the house alive. They implied they had more than they did. It was a calculated gamble, and it worked. What followed was a confession. But a confession delivered in pieces, shaped and reshaped, walking back and adding details in ways that forensic psychologists would later analyze at length. In his initial account, Chris claimed that he had told Shanann he was done with the marriage. He claimed that she had responded by strangling the girls in a fit of rage while he watched. He claimed he had then killed Shanann in a panic and panic buried them at the work site. It was a story designed to deflect, designed to introduce doubt, designed to put as much distance as possible between himself and premeditation. Nobody believed it. Not investigators. Not the prosecutors who would later build the case against him. Not the public, who watched the footage with a kind of nauseated disbelief, because the evidence told a different story. A story of planning, of control, of a man who had decided, with cold deliberate intent, to remove the people standing between him and the life he had decided he wanted. The motive, as it was eventually reconstructed, was both mundane and devastating in equal measure. Chris Watts wanted out. Not just out of the marriage, though that was certainly part of it. He wanted out of the financial pressure, out of the responsibility, out of the identity he had built and grown to resent. He was 40 miles into an affair with a woman who represented in his mind a clean slate, a fresh start, a version of himself unburdened by the family he was supposed to love. He had calculated, in whatever dark algebra runs through a mind capable of such a thing, that the cleanest solution was elimination, not separation, not divorce, not the difficult, painful human process of unraveling a life built with another person. Elimination. And in the early morning hours of August 13th, 2018, while his daughters slept and his pregnant wife lay in the bed they had shared for years, Chris Watts had made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He had killed Shanann first, and then he went to the rooms where his daughters slept. The details of what happened in that house, the sequence, the specific moments, are documented in the case files. They are available, but they are the kind of details that, once read, are impossible to unknow. They speak to a capacity for coldness that the human mind struggles to fully absorb. How does a man do what Chris Watts did? How does a person who coached youth sports and made pancakes on Sunday mornings and posted family photos with loving captions, how does that person become this? That was the question that investigators, prosecutors, psychologists, and millions of people watching the story unfold online would all be asking in the days and weeks ahead. And as August 15th turned into August 16th, as the bodies were recovered, as the confession was documented, as the handcuffs went on, that question had never felt more urgent, because the answer, it turned out, was more disturbing than almost anyone had imagined. Now that the truth had been pulled from the ground on that desolate stretch of Colorado prairie, only one question remained. How did Chris Watts think he was going to get away with it? It's a question that investigators, prosecutors, and criminal psychologists would return to again and again in the months that followed. Because the plan, if it could even be called that, was thin in ways that suggest either profound arrogance or a complete dissociation from reality. There were cameras everywhere. There were phone records. There was GPS data embedded in his own truck. There was a neighborhood full of people who knew Shanann, who loved her, who were not going to simply accept a shrug and a vague story about not knowing where she had gone. And yet, Chris had walked into that television interview, looked into the camera, and said the words anyway. He had done it with the kind of composure that, in retrospect, reads not as innocence but as a specific chilling variety of confidence. The confidence of a man who believed on some level that he was smarter than the people looking for him. He was not. Chris Watts was formally arrested on August 15, 2018, 2 days after Shanann had been reported missing. He was charged with first-degree murder, 3 counts for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, as well as an additional charge for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy for the life of Nico, the son who would never be born. He was also charged with 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. He was taken into custody without incident. That same flat calm that had unnerved investigators throughout the 2 days of the search remained intact as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. No breaking down. No visible remorse. Just that same careful stillness, right up until the moment the door closed behind him. The case against Chris Watts was, all from a prosecutorial standpoint, overwhelming. The physical evidence was extensive. The digital trail was exhaustive. The confession, however fragmented and self-serving, existed on video. There was no credible path to acquittal, and whatever legal strategy might have been floated in the early days of representation, it was quickly abandoned in favor of the only option that made any practical sense. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all counts. There was no trial, no drawn-out courtroom drama, no opportunity for Shanann's family to sit across from 12 strangers and watch the evidence laid out piece by piece. Just a guilty plea, entered quietly, as if even the machinery of justice deserved to be spared the full weight of what he had done. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced in a Weld County courtroom. He received 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 for the murders of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, 1 for the murder of Nico, and 1 additional sentence related to the charges of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. He will die in prison. He will never walk free. He will spend every remaining day of his life inside a federal correctional facility, which is precisely where he belongs. Shanann's family, her parents Frank and Sandra Zuchek, her brother Frankie, sat in that courtroom and listened to the sentences handed down. There are no words adequate to describe what it means to watch justice served for the murder of your daughter, your grandchildren, your sister. No sentence erases that. No verdict brings anyone home. But in the faces of the people who loved Shanann and those little girls, something that looked, however fragile, like the first breath of an exhale they had been holding for months. In the years since the sentencing, additional details have continued to emerge that deepen the portrait of what happened inside that house on Saratoga Trail. In 2019, a document known as the Nickel Letters, named after the prison chaplain Chris had been communicating with, provided a fuller account of the murders in Chris's own words. Written from his cell at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, where he is currently held, the letters contained admissions that dismantled what remained of his original confession. He acknowledged that Shanann had not harmed the girls. He acknowledged that he had acted alone, deliberately, and with intention. He described the events of that morning in clinical, almost emotionless detail that prosecutors and psychologists found deeply consistent with the behavior of someone who had planned the killings in advance. He also described, in those letters, the nature of his feelings about his family in the months leading up to August 13th. Not hatred exactly. Something perhaps more disturbing. A kind of detachment. An emotional withdrawal that had been building quietly for months, accelerated by the affair, by the financial stress, by his increasingly urgent desire to simply start over. He spoke about Shanann and the girls as if they were problems to be solved, rather than people to be loved. It is a document that is difficult to read and impossible to forget. The case of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico Watts rippled outward far beyond the borders of Frederick, Colorado. It became one of the most discussed true crime cases of the modern social media era, in part because of how much of Shanann's life had been documented online, which meant that the world didn't just learn about her after she was gone. Millions of people had watched her, had followed along, had left comments on her videos and liked her posts and felt, in the way that social media creates the sensation of connection, that they knew her. The grief that followed her murder was, for many people, genuinely personal, and the rage that accompanied it was real. The case prompted serious conversations about domestic violence, about the warning signs that go unrecognized until it is too late, about the particular danger that exists in relationships where one partner's detachment is invisible to almost everyone around them. And advocacy groups pointed to the statistics that the leading cause of death for pregnant women in the United States is homicide, most often at the hands of a partner. That number is staggering. That it is not more widely known is a failure that Shanann's case helped, in some small way, to address. Her parents established the Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico Watts Foundation, dedicated to child safety advocacy and domestic violence awareness. In the aftermath of unimaginable loss, they chose to build something, to take the names of the people they loved and press them into something permanent and forward-facing. It is one of the more quietly extraordinary acts of grief this story contains. Chris Watts sits in a federal prison today, nearly 8 years after that morning in August 2018. He has given additional interviews from inside. He has continued to write. He has, by various accounts, found religion, expressed remorse, and attempted to present himself as a man transformed by the consequences of his actions. Whether any of that is genuine, whether genuine transformation is even possible in a person who did what he did, is a question that belongs to philosophers and theologians more than to any court of law. What is not a question is this: Shanann Watts was a real person. She was 34 years old, and she was funny and warm and deeply, fiercely devoted to her daughters. She was going to be a mother of 3. She had plans and dreams and an inbox full of unanswered messages and a community of people who loved her. She deserved to grow old. So did Bella. So did Celeste. So did the boy they were going to name Nico. They did not get to grow old. They were taken from the world by the one person in it who was supposed to protect them above everyone else. And that is the fact that sits at the center of this story. No matter how many psychological analyses are written, no matter how many interviews are granted, no matter how many years pass, some betrayals are too large to be explained away by motive. Some losses are too enormous to be contained by a sentence, however just. The Watts family is gone, and the world is smaller and colder for their absence. What this case teaches us if it teaches us anything, is that danger does not always announce itself. It does not always look frightening. It does not always come from a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it lives in the house with you. Why sometimes it drives the kids to school and smiles at the neighbors and stands in front of a television camera, asking for help finding the people it has already destroyed. The warning signs, in retrospect, were there. The emotional withdrawal, the sudden distance, the story that shifted and changed under even moderate pressure. But warning signs only make sense looking backward. At the moment, they are easy to miss. They are easy to explain away. And that is perhaps the most unsettling truth this story leaves us with. Pay attention to the people you love, to the changes that seem small, to the silences that last a little too long. Because sometimes the most ordinary looking life is the one hiding the darkest secret. If the story moved you, if it reminded you how precious and fragile the people in your life truly are, take a moment to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Every conversation this case generates keeps the memory of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico alive. And if you want to keep going deeper into the cases that shake the world and demand to be understood, subscribe and join the community. There are more stories that need to be told.